And certainly, my good friends, no discussion of Catholic colonial Maryland could begin without this thought. On the day of the Annunciation of the Most Holy Virgin Mary, we celebrated Mass for the first time in this island. This had never been done before in this region of the world. When Mass was over, we took an enormous cross, which we had hewn out of a tree, on our shoulders, and proceeded in rank to a designated place. And with the help of the governor, his associates, and the remaining Catholics, we erected a monument to Christ our Savior, while we humbly recited the litany of the Holy Cross on bended knee with much emotion. The date that is described in this quote was the 25th of March, the Feast of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the year 1634. The place, St. Clement's Island, right off the tip of southern Maryland, where the Ark and the Dove, two ships, arrived on that particular day. This locale, St. Clement's Island, with its most interesting museum, may be visited today by tourists and pilgrims alike. The description that we just quoted was written by the English Jesuit Father Andrew White, and the background which leads up to his momentous statement is our starting point this afternoon. So we come back then in history. George Calvert, born in 1597, has been described as an energetic Yorkshireman who became Secretary of State in the government of James I. Calvert was a large investor in both the Virginia Company and in the East India Company, and he had done extensive planting in Ireland as well. The problem with George Calvert, of course, was that he became a Roman Catholic. He converted to the true faith in 1625, and with his conversion to Catholicism, it was necessary for him to relinquish his governmental position as Secretary of State. But out of friendship and out of gratitude to everything Calvert had done and all he had been and all he had meant to the British government, the king gave him a peerage, created him Lord Baltimore, which was named for an area in County Cork in Ireland, and the king encouraged Calvert to establish a proprietary colony in the New World for his co-religionists. On two different occasions, he looked at Newfoundland in Canada, but he felt that the climate was too cold. Jamestown, Virginia appeared very attractive to him, but he could not, in conscience, of course, sign the Protestant oath of supremacy that would be demanded of him as a settler in Virginia. So in the end, Charles I, who succeeded James I, gave Calvert a charter to settle in the northern Chesapeake area, and Calvert, Lord Baltimore, left it to his son Cecil Calvert to organize the actual settlement in the year 1633. Cecil Calvert then proceeded, and he recruited some 17 younger sons of the Catholic gentry in England to finance the expedition. They took with them initially about 100 settlers, the majority of whom were Protestant, indentured servants, and 3 Jesuits, Father Andrew White, Father John Altham, and Jesuit lay brother, Thomas Gervais. These were people of considerable means, of the genteel social class in England, who were looking for the same kind of life in the New World, and of course an opportunity to practice their religion with greater freedom than they were able to in England. Many of these people came from the class that we call the recusants, which comes from the Latin stem recuso, which means I refuse. They refused to pay tithes, they refused to take the oath of supremacy, they refused to worship in the Church of England. Now, generally, with all of these refusals, if they kept quiet and they were far enough from the seat of government in London, they were left alone. But there were some of them who, whether or not they didn't want to keep quiet, God knows, but they were looking for a new way of life. They were looking for greater freedom. And it's these 17 individuals from the Catholic gentry who really formed the basis of the people who set out on the Ark and the Dove, and who ultimately would arrive in southern Maryland. Cecil Calvert had studied very carefully Captain John Smith's account of Virginia, and Cecil gave handwritten instructions to his brother Leonard Calvert, who was actually the one who was going to come over to Maryland and who was going to be the first colonial governor of Maryland. So Cecil gave his brother Leonard very careful handwritten instructions. Leonard was accompanied by two other men, Jerome Hawley and Thomas Cornwallis, both Catholic gentlemen, and they were to be his two co-commissioners. So the earliest known government of Maryland was strictly Catholic. It was in the hands of the Catholics. It was not going to last long at all. But they were going to make a permanent imprint on colonial government for the limited period of time that they had to run colonial government. Now, the instructions that Leonard Calvert received from his brother were very, very exact and very precise. He told his brother that once the colonists got to southern Maryland, they were not to disperse. They were not to go hither and yon, and lose track of each other and so forth, but rather they were to construct a town, and they were to concentrate on becoming self-sufficient just as quickly as they could become self-sufficient. So over they came, and they named the land Maryland. I'd like to be able to tell you it was named after our Blessed Mother, but that is not the case. It was named rather after Charles I's French wife, Henrietta Maria. Well, her middle name was Maria. That was after the Blessed Mother, so I guess indirectly at least we can say Maryland was indeed named after Our Lady without getting Henrietta Maria terribly mad about it. So the land was called Maryland, and the first town was named St. Mary's City. Archaeologists have done extensive research into this initial society. They have unearthed fascinating memorabilia, and today one may visit a reproduction of St. Mary's City on the same land, a reproduction that so easily brings one's mind back to the life that had been in the 17th century. Well, Father White wrote a very long and detailed description, a narrative of the voyage to Maryland. He talks about the very beautiful terrain that they discovered in southern Maryland once they arrived, and he also depicts a very, very fervent group of Catholic people making the crossing from England to southern Maryland. He talks in one part of his diary about a very severe storm that grew up in the course of the voyage. And this is what he wrote. This storm kindled the prayers and vows of the Catholics in honor of the Most Blessed Virgin Mother and of her Immaculate Conception, of St. Ignatius, the patron saint of Maryland, of St. Michael, and of all the guardian angels of that country. And everyone was hastening to purify his soul through the sacrament of penance. For when we had lost control over the rudder, the vessel, abandoned to the waves and winds, soon tossed about like a quoit until God opened a path for her safety. In the beginning, I admit, the fear of losing the ship and of losing my life had seized me. But then I devoted some time to prayer, less tepid than my usual manner. And I proposed to the Lord Christ, to the Most Blessed Virgin, to St. Ignatius, and to the angels of Maryland, that the purpose of this voyage was to honor the blood of our Redeemer through the salvation of the savages, the Indians he's referring to erect a kingdom for the Savior, if he considered our feeble efforts worthy of assistance, to consecrate another gift to the Immaculate Virgin Mother, and many similar things. Close quote. So he may have been scared, but when we are scared, our true religious fervor comes out. If they did not have religious fervor, they wouldn't have been running to confession. They wouldn't have thought a thing about it. They were well grounded in the Catholic faith. I think you or I, if we knew something was going to happen to us today, we'd be running to confession right here at this conference, because the faith is just as fervent here. Well, strictly speaking, Lord Baltimore was granted what we refer to in history as the Palatinate of Maryland. Not the colony of Maryland, the Palatinate of Maryland. Now, what, you ask, is a Palatinate? In English law, I think we can probably define a Palatinate as a feudal fiefdom. A feudal fiefdom. Lord Baltimore was answerable only to the king, to no one else. He received, incidentally, what was called a Bishop of Durham clause in his colonial charter. Durham is a very, very beautiful city. I'm sure some of you have visited it in northern England, very close to the Scottish border. You may have been in the magnificent cathedral at Durham where Cuthbert is buried, and St. Bede, who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, is buried there. The Bishop of Durham was indeed a feudal lord in his time, and if any proprietor anywhere in the world received a Bishop of Durham clause in his colonial charter, he became a feudal fief, if you will. In other words, he was answerable to no one but the king. He was total, complete, and absolute lord and master. So Lord Baltimore, then in Maryland, owned all of the territory, granted all of the territory that had been granted by the king. He received rents, taxes, and fees. He appointed all government officials. He exercised judicial and political authority, and the like. Well, this all sounds wonderful, of course, on paper. But in point of fact, we're talking now about colonial America. And neither this nor any other type of feudal barony could function very well under the spirit of democracy that permeated so much of colonial America. What is really, really significant, though, I believe, is the esteem in which Lord Baltimore was held at court, despite the fact that he had converted to Catholicism. We're talking roughly about a period of 140 years, just to use round numbers, between the time the colonists got here on the Ark and the Dove in 1634 and the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1776. And over that roughly 140 years of history, Maryland underwent several types of government prior to the beginning of the American Revolution. And the lot of the Catholic settlers varied from one type of government to another. Jesuit Father James Hennessy, in his work American Catholics, notes, and we quote, "The proprietors resisted Jesuit efforts to claim privileges and immunities traditional in the Catholic countries of Europe. The Puritans could not abide with the Papists. And under the royal governors, anti-Catholic penal laws were passed and were at least periodically enforced." So in every different period of government in colonial Maryland, the lot of the Catholics varied, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But despite the changing governmental fortunes, Catholics in the colony of Maryland grew and developed, sometimes, as we say, living under harsher conditions than at other times. Under the so-called terms of plantation, the Jesuit Gentlemen of Maryland, as they were legally called, the Jesuit Gentlemen of Maryland, took up land on the very same agreement as their lay counterparts. Now, in the case of the Jesuits, they began with some 4,000 acres of town land and a 3,000-acre manor at St. Inigoes. St. Inigoes is in southern Maryland. Today, you may visit St. Inigoes. It is not a functioning parish church. It's actually right across from a naval station, and you have to go into the naval station to get the key to get in and let yourself into St. Inigoes. Once you've let yourself in, you can appreciate what was Catholicism in the 17th century. Well, this began in 1641, and right at the same time St. Inigoes was established, we also have the development of St. Francis Xavier at Newtown, Maryland, and they claim to be, and I quote, "the first settlement in the Maryland province after St. Mary's City." They began on a very, very small basis at Newtown, St. Francis Xavier, and the final building of the manor and the final building of the church and the development of the adjacent cemetery and so forth at Newtown was not actually realized until the decade of the 1660s, when a gentleman named William Breton and his wife donated 1.5 acres of their own land for the construction of a permanent chapel and manor house. In 1668, the Society of Jesus purchased the entire Breton property at Newtown. It was approximately an 850-acre tract, and the Jesuits bought it for 40,000 pounds of tobacco. Can you imagine? 40,000 pounds of tobacco. They used the manor at Newtown as their headquarters, and from there, of course, they established and maintained missions in other parts of the Maryland colony. Chapel Point is another foundation much worth noting. Chapel Point was begun by Father Andrew White himself. Now, Andrew White was the Jesuit we just mentioned. He came over on one of those two ships. He was, incidentally, a native Londoner, and he had taught theology for a number of years at the English College at Valladolid in Spain. He could have lived the very comfortable life of an academic, the prestigious life of a university professor, but he chose instead to come to the Maryland missions in 1634. Well, as the 1630s went on, many more Catholic settlers arrived in this colony where perceived religious freedom was thought to be the norm. Catholics began to move westward along the Potomac River, and Father White established a claim for what he himself called St. Thomas Manor. Once the building was built, he took up his residence there at St. Thomas Manor, and he erected also a chapel adjacent to the manor, and the chapel was the forerunner, of course, of what became ultimately St. Ignatius Church at Chapel Point, Maryland. Father White labored for many years among the Piscataway Indians. He broke down the language barrier. He wrote a catechism in the Piscataway language, and he brought many members of that Indian tribe into the church. John Gilmary Shea, an early historian of a lay historian of the church in the United States, recounts an incident that many people thought to be miraculous. And Chapel Point's parish history relates Shea's story in this way, and we quote, "Father White carried a relic of the true cross in an especially designated receptacle around his neck. He was called to attend an Indian who had been impaled by the limb of a tree. The branch had gone through the upper part of his body, and he was in great agony and near death. Father White was able to impart the necessary articles of faith, which the Indian accepted, and then he baptized him and administered the last sacraments, leaving instructions that upon death, the body was to be kept for burial with the church's ritual. He blessed the Indian with the relic of the true cross and then departed. The next day, Father White returned to bury the Indian, and he was astonished to find the Indian recovered and gone out fishing. Two small marks were all that were left of the wounds. The same relic of the true cross which Father White brought to America remains at the church." Close quotes. Indeed it does. A Jesuit father blessed me with that relic on my visit there a few years ago. Well, Catholics, for the most part, I think we can say, got along rather poorly in Maryland during the English Civil War, and particularly during Cromwell's period of the Protectorate on the Commonwealth. But by the time of the Stuart Restoration in 1660, and the Maryland Act of Toleration in the late 1650s, the situation had begun to change quite drastically for Catholics. Paul Johnson, the British Catholic historian, in his History of the American People, notes this: "The Toleration Act in Maryland proved invaluable for the colony. The upheavals in England, followed by the reassertion of royal authority and the imposition of the so-called Clarendon Code against dissenters, brought a rush of refugees of all religious persuasions to America, and large numbers chose to go to Maryland, where they lived perfectly happily together." Now, as this life went on, as Catholic life developed in Maryland, what kind of characteristics did it take on? That's a very, very important question to ask and to try to answer. What kind of characteristics did Catholic life in Maryland take on? Again, we quote from Father James Hennessy, Jesuit. Maryland piety, he writes, resembled that of contemporary English Catholics. It was quiet and reserved. The Jesuits promoted devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, understood as the symbol of Christ's redeeming love for humanity. The Eucharistic reservation, normal in settled parish life, could not be had where there was a scarcity of priests and where public Catholic churches were prohibited. So men and women joined a league of prayer in honor of the Eucharistic presence of Christ. They agreed on assigned days to spend a private half hour kneeling in their homes in honor of our Lord's real presence in the Blessed Sacrament, although they themselves so very, very often could not enjoy the real presence of our Lord in the Holy Eucharist. Again, we want to emphasize now that these were people of, considerable means. They had considerable means in Maryland, and they brought at least small or moderate family fortunes with them. They developed very, very substantial homes in colonial Maryland. They very often had chapels within their homes, and many of the circuit-riding Jesuit fathers would come to these homes of the prominent and even the wealthy Maryland Catholics, and they would hear confession, and they would offer Mass in the private residences of so many of these people. Many anti-Catholic pieces of legislation remained on the books in Maryland, despite the fact that Catholics usually, not always, but usually, were little interfered with in the observances of their faith. In early 1704, there was a gentleman by the name of John Seymour who arrived in Maryland to commence a tenure of 5 years as the colonial governor. Seymour was an unequivocal supporter of Anglicanism and nothing but Anglicanism. And he wanted to end any of the moderate toleration that had been implemented by the earliest Catholic settlers. So the Jesuits under Seymour were compelled to begin to distance themselves from the seat of government. Now, I don't mean that he put them out. I don't mean that any of these missions were, forced to close permanently or anything of the sort. But they had to keep quiet, and they could not be physically around the seat of government at St. Mary's City. So from southern Maryland, from St. Mary's County and Charles counties, where the Jesuits had done their earliest work, they were indeed forced to, I suppose we can say, take refuge or move the center of much of their apostolic endeavor to a different part of Maryland. And so they went first of all to Cecil County, which is not terribly far from the border of Pennsylvania. And today it would be also very close to the current day border of the state of Delaware. And there in Cecil County, or if you're British, I guess you would say Cecil County, they began St. Francis Xavier Mission with its corresponding Bohemia Manor. The Jesuits used the plantation and the buildings that they developed there to really try to skirt a number of the Maryland laws, which in the 18th century prohibited the public celebration of Mass. Private citizens, as we mentioned, could indeed have a private shrine or a chapel attached to their home or even in their home. This was under the provision of what became known as Queen Anne's Law. You could have a chapel in the house or attached to the house, but it could not be a publicly designated building that we were calling a chapel or a church. Not only could you have a private chapel in your home, but you could also invite others to come in and to worship with you. Well, many people came to this famous chapel and manor house, Bohemia Manor, St. Francis Xavier Church, which was located in Warwick, Maryland, as we say, close to the border of Delaware. And the Jesuits in residence there once again very quickly became circuit-riding missionaries. Well, in September of 1704, the same Governor Seymour had 2 Jesuits brought before him and the colonial council. Father William Hunter was accused of consecrating a new chapel at St. Inigo's near St. Mary's City, and Father Robert Brooke was accused of offering Mass in the chapel at St. Mary's City. Hunter apologized for any public annoyance, but he explained to the colonial governor that since only a bishop could consecrate a Roman Catholic church or chapel, that the governor could not in conscience accuse him, Hunter, a mere priest, of consecrating any kind of chapel or church. Careful distinction. Father Robert Brooke rather freely admitted that he had indeed done the most horrible thing of offering the Eucharistic sacrifice. Imagine, he offered the Eucharistic sacrifice as priests had always done. And he said that, he had indeed worn vestments. But he said, as far as I know, Governor, I had no congregation present when I put the vestments on. And besides that, it was before you got here anyway, so what are you worried about? Well, both of these Jesuits, Hunter and Brooke, were reprimanded very much by the governor, who went into a rather long tirade, and he said, among other things, and we quote him, you might, methinks, be content to let the exercise of your superstitious vanities be confined to yourselves without proclaiming them at public times and in public places, unless you expect by your gaudy shows and serpentine policy to amuse the multitude and beguile the unthinking weakest part of them. That's what a priest did when he got up to say Mass. Well, so much for that. On a more serious note and a happier note, Catholic education in Maryland. It was talked about from as early as 1640, just 6 years after the Ark and the Dove arrived, although nothing was to come of it for some years. By 1653, however, the Jesuits had opened an academy at St. Francis Xavier at Newtown, and the schoolmaster was one Ralph Crouch, who was a Jesuit lay brother who eventually returned to England. He was succeeded by a layman, Gregory Turberville, a convert to Catholicism, who directed the school at Newtown until his own death in 1684. Maryland Catholics who would be unable to travel distances to a school like the Jesuits ran at Newtown could very, very easily procure the services of private tutors who would come into their home and who would prepare young Catholic children for university education in places like, especially like French Flanders, where a Catholic university education was readily accessible to children living in colonial Maryland. Many of them went to French Flanders. A second Jesuit academy or school sprang up once again at Bohemia Manor on Maryland's eastern shore. And that school was begun by Jesuit Father Thomas Poulton in the 1740s. Father Poulton was actually the superior of the entire Maryland mission of the Jesuits when he was running the school. And one of his confreres, Father Henry Neal, that's an old Maryland name. Father Henry Neal was the superior of Bohemia Manor. Now, the eastern shore of Maryland was sufficiently distant from the seat of colonial government that the Jesuit school was able to escape the fate of Newtown Manor. Newtown Manor was actually closed for a while, temporarily, after the downfall of the Stuart monarchy in England in 1689. It was ultimately able to reopen. But Bohemia Manor, because it was on the eastern shore of Maryland and far enough away from things, was able to escape that, so that from the time it opened, it never closed for any reason whatsoever. And there was a series of reasons throughout the 18th century why it could have closed. But as I say, it escaped the earlier fate of Newtown Manor, which at least at one time did have to close. Some of the earliest students at Bohemia Manor were people like Daniel Carroll II, who had been born in 1730, and James Reynolds, a close friend who was born just a year later in 1731. Carroll is a name that you're all very familiar with, I think. And Daniel Carroll was certainly a member of the Maryland gentry. He prepared at Old Bohemia for an education abroad. He left for Europe in 1742. He returned to take over the burdens of his father's mercantile empire, and ultimately he indeed inherit the entirety of that mercantile empire upon his father's death. Daniel Carroll was certainly one of the framers of the United States Constitution. He was one of only 2 Roman Catholics to sign that very esteemed document. He served as a commissioner for the District of Columbia, and he owned at least part of the land on which the United States Capitol building now stands. Mentioned also in the day books of Old Bohemia Manor were many day students who rode their horses to school from the surrounding countryside. Two of the Neal cousins, Charles and Leonard, both received early educations at Bohemia Manor. They were the sons of William and Anne Brooke Neal from Charles County in southern Maryland. Well, Leonard Neal studied in Europe. He was ordained a Jesuit priest. He became one of the founders of Georgetown Academy. He became one of the founders of the Georgetown Visitation Convent, and he ultimately became the second Archbishop of Baltimore. His cousin Charles Neal also studied in Europe, also became a Jesuit priest, and was remembered for tremendous apostolic work for many years in southern Maryland. Certainly the person who played the greatest role in the formation of the early American church, as the founder of the American hierarchy and the first Archbishop of Baltimore, was John Carroll. He was the younger son of Daniel and Eleanor Darnell Carroll. He was the brother of Daniel Carroll, who signed the Constitution. And John Carroll was born in 1735 in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, studied at Old Bohemia for a time, left for studies in Europe, was ordained a Jesuit priest, became a secular priest at the time the Society of Jesus was suppressed, and then he returned to Maryland to live on his mother's farm at Rock Creek, where he ministered to a very scattered but a growing and now rather substantial Catholic population. John Carroll is very well remembered, I'm sure you know, for the voyage that he made to Canada in company with Samuel Chase of Maryland and also Benjamin Franklin. They went up to Canada to try to get some support from our northern neighbors for the cause of American independence at the time of the American Revolution. And you know, as a result of this, a certain friendship developed between Benjamin Franklin and John Carroll, and Franklin always prided himself on the fact that he had something to do with the fact that John Carroll was appointed the first bishop in the United States. There's a famous letter that he sent over to Rome recommending that, quotes, Mr. John Carroll, superior of the American clergy, be raised to the office of bishop. He always gave himself credit. Now, I would dare say the congregations in Rome would look at this and say, who's this Benjamin Franklin? You know, it wouldn't mean a lot to them in Rome at all. But Franklin gave himself some kind of credit, and you always read about that kind of thing in the history books. Well, Carroll did not need any recommendation from Benjamin Franklin or any other American patriot. I mean, his merits stood very, very much on their own. And he was consecrated the first bishop of the United States at Lulworth Castle, which is in Dorsetshire. It's the ancestral home of his very good friend Thomas Weld. You can still visit the chapel today where John Carroll was consecrated the first bishop of the United States. And when the Diocese of Baltimore was created in 1789, Carroll's diocese extended from the Canadian border to the border of Florida and from the east coast of the United States to the Mississippi River, all Baltimore. In 1808, Baltimore was raised to an archdiocese, and Carroll became the first archbishop. And we had, of course, the establishment of the suffragan sees of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Bardstown, Kentucky. All those areas grew except Bardstown, which stayed a small rural settlement and was ultimately enveloped into the archdiocese of Louisville, Kentucky. There's also some speculation, although it's never really been substantiated, that Archbishop Carroll's first cousin, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, may have received some early education at Old Bohemia Manor. Charles Carroll was the third generation of his family to live in the Maryland colony. The family came from both Ireland and England, traceable to both countries. And you had Charles Carroll the founder, or Charles Carroll the Attorney General, as he's sometimes called, his son Charles Carroll of Annapolis, and then his son Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Carroll of Carrollton was actually born in Annapolis, and the site of his birthplace is today the rectory of Old St. Mary's Church. It is a Redemptorist parish in Annapolis, Maryland. There is the house is little changed really since Charles Carroll's birth, and the church there at Annapolis, I suppose, became not only famous for Charles Carroll's birth as it was for its very famous organist, Charles Adams Zimmerman, who played the organ there for many, many years. Are there any of you fellas here old Navy men? Anybody serve in the Navy? Well, Charles Adams Zimmerman wrote Anchors Aweigh, famous Navy song. So in any event, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the first cousin of the Archbishop, is certainly best known for the fact that he was indeed the only Roman Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. He originally signed Charles Carroll, and one of his confreres in Philadelphia said, "Charles, there's so many Carrolls in Maryland, King George III won't know which one." So he returned to the document and he wrote, "of Carrollton." So King George III would have no doubt which American Carroll patriot was signing the document. He was very, very well known for the series of articles that he wrote against Daniel Dullany in the Maryland Gazette. He wrote under the pen name of First Citizen. And he wrote a very convincing series of essays arguing for American independence against Daniel Dullany, who was arguing, of course, the royal prerogative. John Adams once described Charles Carroll of Carrollton as the wealthiest man in the United States. Whether that was the case or not, he was very, very conspicuously fervent in his practice of Catholicism. He's buried in the chapel of his home at Doregan Manor near Ellicott City. And there's a very interesting statement in his will. He said that he instructed that the holy sacrifice of the Mass be offered over his mortal remains in perpetuity. He's buried right under the main altar at Doregan Manor. My friends, perhaps one of the finest accounts that we have of life in Catholic colonial Maryland comes to us from the Jesuit father Joseph Mosley. 16 letters survive that Father Mosley wrote to his sister, a Mrs. Dunn, who lived in Bladen. Bladen, they tell me, is very close to Newcastle in England. You also have Father Mosley's diary and his day book, and you put the three of them together, and they're a vast, vast source of information on life in Catholic colonial Maryland. Mosley had been living in Talbot County for only about a year when his missionary activity really began to get intensive and to start growing. After 6 years on the western shore of Maryland, he had been instructed by his superiors to establish a mission in the heart of the eastern shore. And that is why, and that's how, St. Joseph's in Tuckahoe came about. By the fall of 1766, he wrote to his sister that in addition to his home base, he had the care of 6 other missions. His parish boundaries included 10 counties and 3 states. He would often travel 300 miles on horseback in the course of a week, and he would stop and he would say Mass, he would hear confession, he would teach children, he would minister to the sick, give the last rites, and so forth. "What part of our labors can we cut off without neglecting our duty?" he wrote to his sister. "Must I refuse when the sick want me? Must I neglect my Sunday church exercise to ease myself by staying home? Must I, when at chapel, refuse to hear half that present themselves, hear their confessions? Must I, if called to the sick at night, sleep until morning, and thus let the sick die without assistance? Must I, if called to a dying man in the rain, stay till it's fair weather?" Well, many of Father Mosley's parishioners were former indentured servants who suffered from a lack of opportunity to provide for themselves and their families. These were very, very hard times for Father Mosley, not only because of life in Maryland, but also because of the suppression of the Society of Jesus. All of the Jesuits working in Maryland became secular priests under the jurisdiction of the Vicar Apostolic of the London District. That would be a bishop in England. And they shared in the, I suppose we can call it, the dishonor hoisted upon their society. Father Mosley admitted to being, quotes, "ashamed to show my face." And yet, like all of the others, he continued on his missionary endeavors. The Society of Jesus remained suppressed in the church for 25 years. Some former Jesuits lived to see their order reinstated. Others died without a clue to the future. But despite all of this, in 1774, Father Mosley could write this of his people: "Our congregations are a mere medley of English, Irish, Scotch, French, Dutch, and country-born. If you mean by people of the country Indians, we ne'er have one in our congregation. The law forbids us to meddle with them. I think the families of English stock are the glory of our flocks, edifying, virtuous, good Christians, and well instructed in the faith." Between 1634 and the American Revolution, over 100 Jesuit priests and about 30 Jesuit brothers served in both Maryland and Pennsylvania. Most were English. Of the 41 Americans who entered the Society of Jesus, 20 returned here to their native turf, and the remainder spent their lives in Europe. 3 Americans were ordained secular priests for work in England. 2 English secular priests were sent out by Lord Baltimore to work with the Jesuits in Maryland. And about 1/2 English Franciscans were in the Maryland colony from 1672 to 1720. The hour is growing late, and I have just 2 final stories to tell you, and I shall be very brief telling you both. But there were 2 final events, very great ones in Maryland's Catholic past. They were the selection of Carroll as our nation's first bishop and the arrival of the first women religious in southern Maryland in 1790. Sacred Heart Church in Bowie, Maryland is the site of the original White Marsh plantation. And in the present sacristy of the church, 20-some priests, then constituting the American clergy, came together to vote on their choice to recommend to Rome for the selection as the first bishop of the United States. This was one of several considerations which occupied these priests, mostly former Jesuits, as they devised plans for the organization of the church in the United States, for the incorporation of the land holdings and possessions of the suppressed Society of Jesus, and for the building of Georgetown Academy. White Marsh Plantation seemed to be an ideal locale for all of the priests to come together. And on March 12, 1788, Fathers Molyneux, Carroll, and Ashton sent a petition seeking permission for the North American clergy in Maryland and Pennsylvania to elect one of their own. On the 23rd of June, the congregation Propaganda Fide acted favorably on the request. On July 6th, Pope Pius VI approved the action. On July 12th, Cardinal Antonelli, Papal Secretary of State, wrote to advise the petitioners of a favorable result, and in November, on November 6th, 1789, you had the publication of the papal brief Ex Hoc Apostolicae, appointing John Carroll the first bishop of the United States. And finally now, the story of religious women told ever so quickly. It takes us to the Carmelite monastery of Hoogstraten, near the town of Antwerp in Belgium. In 1753, this Carmelite monastery had opened its doors to a girl by the name of Anne Matthews from Maryland. By the time of the American Revolution, she was known as Sister Bernardina Teresa Xavier of St. Joseph. She got a lot of names in there. Bernardina Teresa Xavier of St. Joseph. She was elected superior of her community, and about 6 years after her election, she welcomed 2 of her nieces, 2 Matthews girls from southern Maryland, into the convent. Well, one of the most influential persons in the move from Belgium to the United States was Father Charles Neal, who we already mentioned to you. His first cousin, Mother Margaret Mary Brent, was the prioress at the English Carmelite monastery in Antwerp, and she persuaded her cousin, Father Neal, to assume the directorship of the Carmelite sisters. In 1783, Catholic patriots in southern Maryland petitioned the Bishop of Antwerp for a monastery of discalced Carmelites to be founded at Port Tobacco. There were a number of setbacks, and the project did not materialize for some years, but finally, when it did, there were 4 sisters: Mother Bernardina Matthews, her 2 nieces, and a Sister Clara Joseph Dickinson from London. They set sail from Texel, a small island off the coast of Holland, on the 1st of May, 1790, came to the United States. Mother Bernardina, certainly if she was elected the superior of a convent, must have had the virtue of charity. We have to assume she was a charitable woman, of course. And yet when you listen to her diary, and the kind of things that these poor sisters had to put up with when they were making the crossing, this is what she writes. Our passage was very disagreeable on account of the passengers. A man and his wife and 3 little children who were crying almost morning to night. The man and his wife were very disagreeable people who were often quarreling and wrangling. The captain was a poor little mean-spirited, stingy sort of man who had provided very few provisions or necessaries for the passengers. The bread from the first was moldy and not fit to eat. The water was so bad it was not fit to drink. We were forced to strain it through a cloth and let it stand for a day to sweeten before we could drink it. And yet over they came, and you can visit the Carmel at Port Tobacco to this very day. Well, such, my dear friends, is a very small and somewhat long, but still small, sampling of early Catholic Maryland. As with all topics, much more could have been said. Many more truly great people of faith could have been discussed. But in our Catholic colonial history in the United States, Maryland is a story in which we can take much pride. It is the saga of Catholics in search of more religious freedom in the New World than they were able to have in their native land. The story of a people who extended, when they were in power, extended religious freedom to everyone, and yet at times were deprived of it themselves. The story of a quiet but a devoutly lived religious faith. Southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore are fascinating places for tourists and pilgrims alike. To examine the many English Catholic surnames on tombstones in church cemeteries, to realize still that so many of the descendants of the original settlers remain, to hear stories of the many, many hardships based on religious bigotry, to see priests hiding holes in such places as Chapel Point, to think about and meditate on all of our co-religionists endured for the faith in our land, I submit to you this afternoon, should make the American Catholic heart swell with pride. The blood of the martyrs, wrote an early Christian writer, is the seed of the church. Perhaps we might amend that statement a little bit this afternoon to our own purposes and say that the individual martyrdoms in the form of so many hardships on the part of our Maryland Catholic forebears planted the seed for a faith which was to grow so terribly strong in the United States of America. And for that, my dear friends, we cannot thank them sufficiently enough. God bless you, and God love you.